Welcome to the church family that is lifting lives through living love, inspiring hope, filling with faith, and transforming our world. These recorded messages are made available so that you might have additional opportunities to stay connected with us and that you might learn and grow in your faith. God bless you as you hear the word today. And now, the message.
Our scripture reading today is from Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 through 9. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, whom I love. And with him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, "Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." May the Lord bless the reading and hearing of his word.
In the summers when I came home from college, a group of friends we'd always meet on Wednesday nights at the local park, and we would play pickup games of soccer. Most of us had played on the high school soccer team, and so this was kind of like a reunion of sorts, and whenever we got together, we would just divide the teams, without any kind of randomly. We weren't playing for any important stakes except bragging rights, but you would have never known it by the intensity of those games. Like, we played all out. And part of the fun of it was we got to do things that in high school we never could do. For instance, I played defense in high school, which meant that I rarely went past midfield. But when we play these pickup games, I could do things that I always wanted to do back when I was in high school. I could play offense. So one particular game I remember, I took the ball all the way down to the corner, the other side, teams in line, and then kind of dribbled around a couple guys, on the baseline, and then hit the cross that went right across the net. And meanwhile, my buddy BJ, who also played defense with me in high school, he was crashing down through the box, and just, it was like one of those perfect moments where the pass came across the front of the goal. He headed it straight into the back of the net. It looked in our minds just like it looks on the World Cup, right? And our reaction was instantaneous. I ran to the center field screaming, "Goal!" Slid on the ground like I was a professional soccer player. He came along afterwards and tackled me, and we're rolling on the ground screaming, and all of our friends are looking at us like, "You idiots. This game had no meaning. This goal, what are you doing?" We couldn't help it. We were just so overjoyed and excited. So the question I have for you is, in that moment where we are celebrating a pointless goal, but celebrating it with such excitement in our chest, what was the feeling? What word would you give to that emotion that was taking place? For us, I would contend to you that the emotion was glory. That for one brief second at College Park, that's what we were experiencing, a moment of glory. I think this is why we love sports so much in our culture, because sports gives us this perfect platform to experience glory. In Indiana, kids, almost every home has a backyard hoop, right? And kids are in the backyard shooting hoops. And what do they do when they're shooting? They don't just shoot, they imagine the clock kicking down, 3, 2, 1, swish, and the crowd goes wild. What are they rehearsing? They're imagining glory. And it's not just sports that provide us this platform for glory. It's present in movies and entertainment, some of the best stories that we love. The reason we love those stories is because they give us some insight, some experience into glory. Or sometimes when we go to a concert and we get so caught up in the music where time and space seem to fall away, it's a moment of glory. Or sometimes when we go walking out in nature and we come across the perfect view or a sunrise or a sunset, and in that moment we just breathe and drink it all in. What are we drinking in? Glory. I would contend to you that every single one of us is wired by God for glory. It's how he made us. That we are made to know and reflect God's glory. This story of the Transfiguration, it used to always befuddle me. I mean, what a strange story, right? Jesus is changed suddenly into this glowing white being, and there's Moses and Elijah. Why those two characters from the Old Testament? And then the most strange part to me was then as they leave, he tells the disciples, don't tell anyone what you just saw, as if that would be possible. What is this story even about? Well, I would suggest to you this story is about glory. For a few brief moments, a few of Jesus' disciples get to see him in all of his glory. And here's the thing about glory. Whenever we get a taste of it, no matter how brief, glory stays with us. It transforms everything. So let's kind of dig into this story just a little bit. Before we start with Matthew chapter 17, we really got to step back one chapter, Matthew chapter 16. Because prior to this story, Jesus takes the disciples on a retreat to Caesarea Philippi. And at this retreat, he asks them two questions. The first question he asks is, who do people say that I am? And the disciples reply, well, rabbi, teacher, prophet. Some people say Elijah, John the Baptist. So he says, okay. But then comes the second question, the more important one. Who do you say that I am? And the disciples sit in silence for a moment until Simon, who's always the most brash and bold, speaks up and says, you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And as soon as he says that, Jesus says, yes. And he praises God for revealing this answer to Simon, changes his name to Peter. On this rock, I will build my church. And just when Simon Peter is puffing out, it's just because this is his moment of glory. He got it right, except it's so brief. Because then Jesus begins to talk about what he must endure, that his suffering is coming. And when he predicts that, Simon Peter says, no, forbid it, Lord. To which Jesus replies, get thee behind me, Satan. You see, the disciples have this brief momentary understanding, but really they need to go deeper to understand who Jesus is. So 6 days later, he selects 3 of them, Peter, James, and John, and he leads them up onto a mountaintop. And there on the mountaintop is where his glory, his true identity will be revealed. Now this story, in order for us to kind of really grasp it, it is just dripping with Old Testament references. You kind of have to have the Hebrew story in the background as you read this story. So let me just kind of unpack some of the Old Testament references for you. First off, there's the fact that when Jesus talks to, the people who appear are Moses and Elijah. Why Moses? Why Elijah? Well, it's commonly put forward that they represent the law and the prophets. Moses, the giver of the law, Elijah, the quintessential prophet, that these two represent the whole totality of the Hebrew scriptures, law and the prophets. But it's also true that Moses and Elijah, they each had their own mountaintop experience of God. Moses came when he was on Mount Sinai receiving the 10 Commandments. And while he was up on Mount Sinai, he famously prayed, God, Lord, let me see your glory. To which God replied, well, you can't see my face. No one can see my face and live. But hide in the cleft of this rock. I will place my hand over you and cause my glory to pass before you. And after I've passed, I'll remove my hand. So Moses got to see this passing glimpse of God's glory. Meanwhile, Elijah, he fasted on Mount Horeb for 40 days, not in the cleft of a rock, but at a cave. And at the end of 40 days, God calls him forth and says, I'm about to make my glory pass by. And then there was this heavy wind and earthquake and fire 3 separate times where you would think God is present in those, but he's not. Instead, after all have passed, there came the sound of sheer silence. A still small voice, some translations say. And when Elijah heard that, that was where he recognized the glory and presence of God. Interestingly, in both those stories, the number 40 shows up. Elijah 40 days on Mount Horeb, Moses 40 days on Mount Sinai. And then add to this, when Moses, after his experience for 40 days, when he came down off the mountain, his face was radiant. It shone like the sun. He reflected so much of God's glory, being in God's presence, that the people of Israel had to place a veil over his face because otherwise they were scared. It was too bright. So they put a veil over his face while he read the law to them. It's funny because in all the Gospels, this is the way Jesus' face is described on the Mount of Transfiguration. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white, which isn't a reference back to Moses, but is actually a prefiguration of what the angel's appearance will be like in Matthew 28. At the moment of resurrection, the angel's appearance is like lightning. His clothes is white as snow. In other words, Jesus there on the Mount of Transfiguration, he's reflecting the glory of God just as Moses did thousands of years before. His raiment is so dazzling white, it anticipates the glory of the angels. And just in case you're not getting the signs that this is a story about glory, then the Shekinah appears. The Shekinah is the Hebrew word for the cloud. The cloud that falls on the mountain of transfiguration. It's not just some ordinary cloud. It's not an overcast day. This is the cloud of the presence of God. Remember in the Old Testament, Exodus 13, the people of Israel were led in the wilderness by a cloud by day and pillar of fire by night. When Moses went up on Mount Sinai to receive the 10 Commandments, what happened? The cloud, the Shekinah of the Lord descended and covered the top of the mountain. When they built the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant to house the 10 Commandments and to travel with the people, there over the tent of meeting, the Shekinah, the cloud of Yahweh appeared and covered it over. When Solomon built the temple one day, and they dedicated to God, as they were dedicating, the priests had to leave in a hurry because the cloud, the Shekinah of God fell upon it, and the priests couldn't complete their duties because the glory of the Lord filled the temple. I guess what I'm trying to say is you ever driven down south and seen signs for Rock City? You ever done that? You are hundreds of miles away from Rock City, and you'll start seeing the first billboards pop up. See Rock City, see Rock City. But more and more you drive, there's over and over. I've never once been to Rock City, but I know the sign, see Rock City, see Rock City. In this case, I feel like as you read the story, there's hundreds of signs pointing out, and every single sign says glory, 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 glory. And all those glory arrows are pointed in to Jesus. Finally, the voice of God speaks, and it says, "This is my Son, my beloved, with whom I'm well pleased." We cannot miss who Jesus' identity is. It's an exact repeat of the same words that were spoken when Jesus was baptized. In that moment when he came out of the river Jordan, the clouds were opened up, the dove descended, and God declared, "This is my Son, my beloved, with whom I am well pleased." Except here, the gospel writers add an extra phrase, "Listen to him," which again is an Old Testament reference back to the book of Deuteronomy, when Moses declared to the people, "One day the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you. You must listen to him." And just when you think all these Old Testament references are over, we're not quite done yet. Because then if we skip over to the Gospel of Luke, Luke records that as Moses, Elijah, and Jesus are talking, they're talking about something very specific. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. It's kind of a strange way to talk about what they talked about his departure. Well, the Greek word for we translate as departure is exodus. They spoke to Jesus about his exodus. And you can't use the word exodus without invoking that story of the people of God being liberated from the oppressor of Egypt. William Barclay puts it this way. He says, the word exodus is the word which describes what we may call the most adventurous story in human history, a journey in which a whole people in utter trust in God went out into the unknown. That is precisely what Jesus was going to do. Following this moment in Luke's gospel, after the moment of the transfiguration, from then on, Jesus' face is set to Jerusalem. No matter what he does, no matter who he teaches or where he goes, always, 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 Jesus' face is set to Jerusalem. He knows this is where God is ultimately leading him. He is sent, same as Moses was sent, to liberate his people. Except he wasn't liberating them from a foreign power, a foreign oppressor. He's liberating them from the power of sin and death. And this second Exodus will feature a Passover event, the death of the firstborn son, the sacrifice of a lamb. Except in the second Exodus, the firstborn son and the lamb are one and the same. Jesus will lay down his life as an atonement to save us from the power of sin and death. And everything that takes place on that mountain, the cloud, the vision of glory, the conversation with those who've gone before, the anticipation of the heavenly glory he'll someday have, every single bit of it is meant to strengthen Jesus for the cross that is before him. So why does he bring along some disciples? I mean, if that's what it's for Jesus, what did it mean to the disciples? Why did he want to share this moment with them? Well, I would contend to you that just as God is preparing Jesus for the work of the cross, Jesus is preparing his disciples for the wonder of the cross. He wants them to understand who he is and why he has to travel this road. Unfortunately, disciples don't necessarily get it. They see the vision, they see the glory, but Simon Peter, in usual form, speaks up and blurts out something that shows his incomplete understanding. He says, Lord, Master, it's good that we're here. Why don't I build a tent, 3 tents, one for each of you, Moses, and Elijah. What is he offering to build a tent for? Well, the shelter, or the tent that he's trying to create, it's a reference to a Jewish festival, the Festival of the Booths, sometimes called the Festival of the Tabernacles, a week-long celebration in which people would build what they called sukkots, kind of a booth or a tent, a tabernacle, in which they would live for a week in order to remember the experience of their ancestors traveling through the wilderness and living in tents. It was a way of celebrating and remembering the gift of the miracle of the Exodus. And so Peter is basically saying, it's good that we're here. Let's build a tent. Let's make this moment last. Let's stretch it out at least a week, right? But no sooner does he speak these words than the Shekinah, the glory of God, descends. And the voice of God speaks, "This is my son." And when the disciples hear the voice of God speaking, they fall flat on their faces in fear and wonder. And by the time they look up, Jesus comes to them and touches them, while their faces are still down, I should say. Which, it's interesting, Jesus doesn't repeat this action of coming to them until after the resurrection in Matthew 28. He comes to them and he touches them and he says, "Get up. You don't have to be afraid." And when they look up, they see no one except Jesus. No Moses, no Elijah, no cloud, no face shining like the sun. It's all gone. What was it for? What was it about? Well, to me, it goes back to that image of the Shekinah. You see, the Shekinah, the glory, the cloud of God, in the Old Testament, it inhabited a place. It filled the temple. It filled the tabernacle. And so when Peter says, I want to build a booth, I want to build a tent, it wasn't just for Moses, Elijah, and Jesus. He also wanted to build a tent in which the Shekinah, the glory of God, could dwell. And so I think the story is telling us something about the glory of God, that it doesn't inhabit a place where we have to build a tent for it. It doesn't inhabit a moment that we have to stretch out as long as we can. Rather, the glory of God inhabits a person, Jesus, who journeys with us wherever we go. Commentator Eugene Boring puts it this way. He says, without heavenly companions, without heavenly glory, Jesus is the tabernacle, the reality of God's abiding presence with us. The disciples descend from the mountain into the mundane world, accompanied by Jesus, who is God with us. You see, that's all the disciples need, to know that Jesus is the abiding presence of God. They will follow him anywhere. They'll follow him all the way through the Exodus. They'll follow him through his death and his resurrection and his exaltation. They'll follow him because they've seen his glory. There's an old hymn. You guys probably know it. Where he leads me, I will follow. You know that one? Where he leads me, I will follow. Where he leads me, I will follow. Where he leads me, I will follow. I'll go with him all the way. For the first 3 verses, the focus is on us, what we do, right? We'll follow him through the garden. We'll follow him through the judgment. We'll go with him all the way. But I love how the last verse flips it around. He will give me grace and glory. He will give me grace and glory. He will give me grace and glory. And go with me all the way. See, that's the point of this moment of glory for the disciples. It's not just their commitment to go with him, but their knowledge that when they go down into the valley, the glory of God goes with them all the way. You see, this story, it points us to a strange truth. That in this lifetime, our experiences of glory are brief and few and far between. We just don't get to dwell in glory. We may want to build a tent, but we can't keep it. Like it happens in these little brief moments. Reverend Grace Matthew, she puts it this way. She says, all of us in life, we have these moments where the veil is pulled back. The veil that separates this world from the next. And when that veil is pulled back, we get a brief glimpse of who God is. We get to hear his voice. We get to feel his presence, know that we are loved. But faith is not measured by what we do in those moments. She said, faith is what happens between the last time we saw God and the next time we get to see him. Faith is what happens not on the mountaintop, but down in the valley. And that doesn't mean that what happened on the mountaintop isn't important. In fact, it is. It makes all the difference in the world. Back to William Barclay, he says, the moment of glory, it doesn't exist for its own sake. Rather, it exists to clothe the common things in a radiance that they never had before. That's why we get those moments. That's why we get those glimpses. Because they transform every other moment of our lives. It's what sustains our faith, to know that God is with us as we go through the valley together. For the disciples, This little brief moment of glory, it transformed everything. It's what changed the cross from being an instrument of oppression and violence into being an instrument, a symbol of God's love and forgiveness. It's what transforms the tomb from being a moment, a symbol of the finality of death to being a symbol of victorious eternal life. It's glory that transforms all the everyday things through which we live. And so I simply ask you, when was the last time you experienced God's glory? When was the last time you got a glimpse of his presence, of his voice? Maybe it's been a long time, and if so, that's okay. But my point is simply we hold on to those moments, those glimpses of glory. And like the disciples, we know that when we walk through the valley, Jesus goes with us all the way.